So here's a basic sample grid, which you've received as a handout in that folder on Dropbox that I gave you access to. And if you haven't checked it out already, don't worry, it's still sitting there. It'll be there tomorrow. Now, a little bit of story here. That the idea for a revision grid was something I thought I'd invented, because several years ago now, I was working with someone on a manuscript, and I wanted to keep track of some specific things scene by scene. And I then discovered, when I thought I'd invented it, that in fact this was something that had been around forever, and that also was sometimes called a revision map. So that's fine. This is the basic template that I originally created back then. And the thing to understand about it is that it's flexible. You set it up so that each line going across, each row, is where you put information about a particular scene. And then going down in the columns, you keep track of whatever it is you want to keep track of. Okay. I found I had to somewhat broaden my definition of a scene, because I want to account for all the chunks of material in a manuscript. So for example, when I say down at the bottom there that a scene type can be action, dialogue, description, if you have a lengthy piece of description, there's nothing happening there, but it might be integral to the story. I'm not dead set against pieces of description, so I'm going to account for that in my row by row noting down of information. Transition is another kind of scene that might not really seem like a scene. That's those key paragraphs, usually fairly short, that take you from one scene to another, because sometimes you don't just cut and go from the scene to the other scene. You have a paragraph or two of transitional action that doesn't perhaps qualify as a scene. So you can use this in a lot of different ways. I set this up focusing on the type of scene, where it happened, location, and what the key events were, because that's what I wanted to keep track of in that case. And I find that's a good starting point for the template, but it's very adaptable. You can create columns for all of your main characters. Each of them gets their own column, so you can keep track of which scenes they appear in, which scenes two characters appear in together, something you can keep track of. Whatever you want to find, you can set that up for it. Sometimes if you're not sure what you want to find, you just want to start off with some basics and see what patterns emerge, you can do that. One particular way that I adapted this grid was that I kept track of story time in one particular story, because there was a crucial element to the plot that involved the growth of a pumpkin. And I thought that there was something funny that happened to it, that it suddenly got a lot bigger. And it wasn't easy to tell, because the amount of story we had went into much more detail in certain key places. And so it felt like things were, more time was passing than really was. But when you put the actual dates down in the story, you discovered, yes, there was a problem with the growth rate of that pumpkin. That's a rather small thing, but it was crucial to the story and helped to plot that out in my grid. So that's one thing that I did with it. Here's another one, and this one actually shows the grid done in Excel, which I find a little bit easier to use than in Word, because Word doesn't like to be manipulated with too many different rows and columns. Word gets a little feisty. So you may, if you have Excel or something like that, you might find Excel to be a good way to create a grid. And just if you look at this, you can see this is type of scene, location, key events. One of the things I was keeping track of here was scene type. I was very interested in that because I felt there were places where we had too many of the same type of scene appearing right after each other. And in fact, when I plotted this out, I found, yeah, there are places where you've got, you know, a dialogue scene, a dialogue scene, a dialogue scene. And I thought that got a little monotonous. So we looked at that and figured out ways to break that up. You can even draw these out by hand. You don't have to set them up on your computer if you prefer to do that. And you can get very complicated with it. This is a particularly complicated grid that someone created of their story. They had a lot of different things they wanted to keep track of, some of them very specific, such as, were there any hallucinations mentioned in a particular scene, because hallucinations were an element of the story that they wanted to keep track of. They kept track of the starting page and the ending page so they could find the scene. You can see that over on the right. And they had a key question. If you look at the column G, sort of a little bit left to the middle, description. Where is the conflict? How does the scene move the story? So they really wanted to make a note about that as well. You can get very discursive in your comments in a grid. You can just keep it very simple. Lots of possibilities.